I'd like to start, if I may, by asking Flora to comment on.
Thank you for 3 great presentations, and I think sitting here, I'm just blown away by the amount of information coming, you know. Yeah, actually coming from outside the discipline of architecture, but been collaborating with architects in the past few years, and I find it very interesting explorations that we've got here. I actually want to start asking, maybe just not commenting, but also asking a question. Going back to Theo's presentation, you know, you're talking about autonomous cars and machine learning, and basically looking at all these different techniques that have been first invented in computer science and adapted in architecture. And I see a lot of slides on supervised learning, but I haven't seen sort of adaptation of unsupervised learning. And I think that is something that I see is quite, you know, maybe is something that can be done in the future. Unsupervised learning actually supposed to predate supervised learning, but what I see is there's a potential even having computation be embedded not just in the design process, but also in built environment, like as we can see from Abdulmajid's project of Al-Bar. We now potentially have data coming from all different you know, parts and components of that kinetic facades, and also the building monitoring system. So we have sort of the data that can come very clean and sort of structure. So what is the future for you know, adaptive building for machine learning? I'm actually saying, like, it's great that building is responsive, but somehow what if, you know, the responsive behavior is also adaptive, like, you know, because I think, as you said, you know, as Usman said, we're trying to tweak parameters to match the desired visualization. We've been tweaking parameters to match what we like to see, even on a building. But what about if the building is faced, if what we design is faced with an extreme change or an extreme environment, harsh environment? And I think that's where the unsupervised learning can come in, and you know, you can then start doing some trend analysis. Like, for example, it's not just about open and close, or maybe it's open and closing in the wrong way. When, you know, there's a really strong wind and a very different weather environment that, you know, it's never happened previously. You know, so you know, how can a building on a design respond in a very adaptive way? And what is the role of unsupervised learning? I think that's my question to the 3 of you.
I actually have a question and a comment. Actually, I'm not sure that was a responsive facade, was it? Because you pre-program an algorithm that determines which ones are open and closed. You don't actually have sensors that are responding and then distributing the response.
Right. We have a combination of both. Originally, or let's just say in principle, it is a preset program, as you said, because as we explained in the video, we know that we have the data telling us, you know, what is going to be the behavior of the sun, and we know at what time it rises and what time it sets. So we can make a preset program accordingly. However, what we cannot predict is unusual conditions. Therefore, we do have light sensors, we do have wind sensors that will inform the program of unusual conditions, and it has an overriding system. So say, for example, if it's very windy, or there's a sandstorm, or there's, let's say, a lot of rain, it will order the mashrabiyah to fold completely, because this is the most robust position, and it will fix it so that it doesn't move when it's too windy or when it has what is subjected to extreme conditions. So this is something that we have taken into consideration when we're formulating our risk mitigation strategy.
So is the sensing actually distributed, so every panel has its own sensors?
Every panel has its own ID.
No, its own sensors?
No.
So there is a central controller that's kind of issuing instructions?
Yeah, we have one light sensor at the top of each building and one wind sensor, and really this is all you need, because you don't want every mashrabiyah to behave separately when you have, let's say, a windstorm. Because if you have too many different configurations, then obviously that will start creating unpredictable wind behavior. So you need them all to take the same position.
But
So
I would argue that that's actually the opportunity for building a responsive, adaptive facade that actually
true,
takes
but
into account that would actually be able to respond to, for example, climate change effects dynamically. Because otherwise you've got to recompute for
true, but you have
unusual
to
behavior.
you have to also consider, if you allow each and every panel to work separately, then managing the outcome and the prediction of that behavior becomes very difficult, because at the end of the day, this is not a standalone system. You have an MEP system integrated with it, you have a lighting system that works accordingly, and we have lots of things. You have the people inside the building. The last thing you want is something to start behaving in a random and unpredicted way and start scaring off the occupants. So,
But this is the really interesting thing, that actually we have a facade that could have been adaptive, but because we don't want to scare anyone with an unexpected outcome, we've built a top-down.
I accept it's an opportunity. It could have been an opportunity to explore these things. But at the end of the day, if we were the people owning the building, or if it was, let's say, a people where it's going to be inhabited by architectural students, by all means, we would have gone for it. But it is a building that belongs to a very serious governmental branch. It is going to be inhabited by very busy people and very serious people. So again, it's all about striking a balance. We have achieved something which I think is unique.
No, it's beautiful. I guess
Let's secure that, and then we'll.
What I'm getting
go,
to is,
we'll
it's kind of the problem of the wobbly bridge as well, which was a
Yeah.
beautiful bridge, but because of the concerns of the client, the actual beauty of it was sort of engineered out, if you like, in order to make a rigid bridge that actually was probably less structurally stable than something that was flexible and dynamic. And I think that the opportunity we're given with these kinds of interactive, responsive, adaptive mechanisms is actually to make things more robust. And I do think it's our duty as designers, as people who put stuff into the world, to sort of take people along that journey and say, you know what, things might be unexpected. When you have this intelligent, smart home that everyone's sort of thinking is going to come, what happens if you flick the light switch and the light doesn't go on because it actually doesn't, it's got an opinion of its own?
Yes. Again, the first slide that I presented in my PowerPoint was, we're not alone on a project. And as much as we might be ambitious and as much as we might think certain things can work in a particular way, at the end of the day, on this project alone, I had to deal with no less than 200 engineers, probably about 20 different construction directors, project directors, our own directors at the office were at least 10 that took turn over the project, and 70 people internally only that worked on the project. And the list goes on. And you will have, because you're the author of the concept, right? And you do realize more than others the benefits. And you're trying to communicate the same message over and over again, but to different people from different backgrounds with completely different education. And, I would say level of understanding. Some people have the capacity to understand these things, others don't. So you get an enormous amount of resistance and relentless onslaught from these people resisting this unique system, because for them it represents nothing but risk. This is their mentality. They don't see what you see, an opportunity to do something new, to explore something new, to offer architecture and the building industry and people something new. All they think is, I've got this much money, I have this much time, and I have my duty to deliver this building. How can I do it in the simplest, easiest, most straightforward way? And all of things will come in place. The system as it is now was going to be value engineered altogether at some point. But we managed to convince the client that no, if you do that, you have to change your MEP, you have to change your curtain wall design, you have to change the form and so on. And this is how we managed to keep it in, because it was integrated within the building. But any more complexity than that, we probably would have lost it.
I've got a question, and I have to say that I have great sympathy for your comment about the number of people that you had to deal with and so on. I mean, it sort of strikes a very familiar chord. Yeah. And also sympathy for you because you've stuck something really big and really real in front of us, so you're liable to be the person who gets the most criticism immediately. But my question is this. Does the building shut down completely on public and religious holidays?
Not in terms of the performance of the facade. It has to carry on working.
No, why?
Because if it doesn't, then the building will overheat. And if it does overheat, it may cause condensation and it will ruin all the interiors.
That by shutting down, I meant that it, as it were, shrouded everything extended to its maximum extent.
If you mean not being occupied?
No, fully deployed, in other words. Fully closed down.
No, we leave it running normally.
Right. Now, is this because it's a performance?
This is how the computer works. If there is no need to shut it down, then it won't shut down.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, even during public holidays, you're still going to have the facility managers taking care of the building. There's still going to be the security. There's going to be people who are going to take care of any emergency, including those that are operating the facade. However, having said that, during the evening, it's a different scenario. During the evening, we don't have the sun. It doesn't make a difference whether you fold it or unfold it. And there was an event where during the anniversary of the independence of the UAE, it was the 51st, I think, or 52nd anniversary. The government came and asked the building, the facade, to be completely unfolded. And then they brought their laser projectors and they started projecting all sort of different things related to the UAE, the flag, the 51st anniversary, the picture of the Sheikh and his children, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it became a digital media screen.
Good. Thank you very much. Theo.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the project a lot because I think it's, in a certain sense, it's a testimony to how little of this stuff is out there. So I think part of informing and educating a larger audience, clients, governments, institutions, so forth, is also a test of proof of concept. I think the more that we can sort of argue through prototyping and making, I think the more then we can have more informed conversations and raise the level generally about what it means to have an adaptive system. You mentioned, Flora, sorry, the concept of supervised and unsupervised. We do have control systems that deal with uncertainty and latency, and we see that not as value tweaking and so forth, but you see it in traffic control systems, let's say in airports. You see it in a hybridized system between autonomous systems and project management when you have importing of goods in ports and so forth. So we have highly complex systems being able to negotiate and deal with large populations, with large kind of things. We don't see that in architecture. It's generally rendered with a certain idea of performance, and I think Usman's comments are, and Stephen's basically opening up the conversation, that if you design that system and it's built there, it becomes an opportunity to explore and experiment. I think that's obviously an important feature, and I think it's probably the goal that possibly we would all share. The idea, though, behind making right now is actually radically different. So, for example, in our context, work primarily with students, and typically Masters of Architecture and Urbanism. We are working with computation. We develop models and prototypes to a certain degree. It's all, let's say, self-financed, self-motivated, with a desire that those things actually can influence, and it does. Our students go on and perform in different capacities, but at the same time, it's an acknowledgement, I think, about how much work needs to happen. And I think this idea of collective is something that just has to be reinforced, because I don't think it's about sort of arguing the difference between a parametric state or more interactive promises and practices or behavioral ideas and so forth. There's actually acknowledgement that those diversities could be synthesized within a much larger kind of ambitious project for architecture. And that was one of the things that I just tried to elicit. Most of the things that I showed was not stuff that we did, is stuff that actually are references of very particular ways of thinking that I believe are very relevant for us today as a young group or generation that's going to obviously have to fight for the relevancy of architecture and space. It's just something that is not a given in terms of the value of what that actually has, but as soon as you create a building like this, or any building that has a capacity beyond just managing clients' square meters, I think they see the added value, and that sort of opens up opportunities, generally speaking.
I'd like to ask Usman a question about the idea of generalization, because like him, I share a real enthusiasm for the local, and I just wonder how you go, as it were, up a scale. So you get locally general.
Well, I think that one of the things that's not talked about quite so much, which I think you're almost getting at there with the question on unsupervised versus supervised, is this idea of the fitness function. Because at the end of the day, the definition of the fitness function actually is almost the most important act. It's the thing that the designer puts in at a local level that basically determines what optimal is or what performance should be. You know, whether preservation of the physical structure is the thing that is the fitness. And so, to the extent that you want to look at anything that's scaling from the local to global, I think that figuring out a way, and it might be sort of getting towards some kind of unsupervised learning type system, but the basic quality of anything that you're trying to scale outwards, I think, has got to be one in which that fitness function is itself dynamic. In other words, it's not pre-programmed, it's not hard-coded. It is something where the successive local instances, whether they're buildings or whether they're web apps or whether they are experiences, are in some way, it's the fitness function itself that is changing from location to location, because that is what actually will elicit in a locally specific response. Whether it's a facade in a different city or whether it's somebody else's house, defining the mechanism for defining the fitness function, I think, is the key.
Could I ask you about that? So do you think that your work or your thinking would be much more integrated to the existing? To, let's say that this kind of example is a project that it's probably the one that uses in a more extensive way responsive systems. And I think that Theo was talking about a radical change in architecture with machine learning, probably something being built and changed constantly. And I would like to understand more your thinking about the data making and capturing, and if you would think that the change here, for example, would come by making it much more responsive, real-time responsive, or it would be a radical one, different, in this kind of scale.
So I think you're actually getting to the crux of the matter, for me anyway. This really interesting question, which is, and I referred to the light switch that may or may not have an opinion, and I also refer to the restaurant at the end of the universe, where there's this passage where they get into the lift and they say, we'd like to go up, please, and the lift says, well, have you considered the possibilities of down? And they say, well, no, we really want to go up. And they say, well, no, look, think about going down because it's, et cetera, et cetera. And in an authentically intelligent system, we are going to find ourselves confronted with behavior that we don't necessarily like or, more importantly, agree on. And so that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is purely responsive, in the same way that a light bulb responds to a light switch. Now, I guess it was partly Gordon Pask trying to figure out where in that spectrum we should have, and he referred to the distinction between sort of novelty and prediction, where actually you don't necessarily want complete novelty and you don't necessarily want complete prediction, where actually the really important aspect was, how do you find a way to agree on something? So how do I agree with, or how do I negotiate with the lift and find a point at which we agree? How do I negotiate with this opinionated light switch that actually, where it's not an autocratic, no, put the bloody light on. It's like, having to convince each other and be convinced backwards. And so, I think that's the essential point I'm making is it's not about being purely interactive / intelligent. It's not about being purely responsive. It's about building that mechanism that enables us to figure where on the spectrum to be.
I have many more questions, but I will let you.
Go ahead, please.
No, I will let you continue on that.
I think, again, being the boring realistic, perhaps maybe part of this conversation. It's see, one of the reasons, again, that led us to take the decision of not making the thing react real time all of the time is the fact that you will then put the system and the components under movement for a much longer period of time, which means that their life cycle is going to be a lot shorter, and there's going to be a heck a lot of maintenance involved, and which again increases the risk factor and the fact that the whole thing is going to be more expensive and more of a headache for the client. So again, I think for me, whether to choose the thing to become completely intelligent, let's just say, or responsive, or whether you sort of have some sort of control over it, it all depends on how is it going to affect the final outcome and the performance that you aspire to. If the difference is going to be so little that you don't necessarily perceive it, then here you might want to ask yourself the question, is it worth really going through all this hassle and spending all this money and try to convince the client furthermore why you should go for these things? Now, as far as I'm concerned, if you ask me personally, I wouldn't be an advocate for a facade like this, surprise to anyone, because I wouldn't start off with a glass facade to start with. But it wasn't my decision, and it wasn't my director's decision. It was the client decision, because this is what they're used to out there. If it's an office building, it's glass, panoramic, period. Anything you want to add to that, you have to start from that point, you see. And this is where all of this complexity came about. Otherwise, I would have made the building 70% solid, only 30% transparent, and perhaps that 30% could have had something dynamic to it.
Sorry. I'm going to cut across this. There are an awful lot of other people out here who might want to add a comment to this discussion. I believe that there are mics traveling around the auditorium. If anybody wants to make a comment at this point.
Could I just mention something in the meantime? You said you were being the boring guy. I think the reality of the whole thing is this, that I think if we really want to be specific about it, you know, if Usman really feels strongly, he hacks into your system and he makes it dance in a different way. But I think that one of the reasons, I think we have to be very explicit in terms of the parameters that drive the system. And those are not generic features. You're dealing with solar shading. To be honest, you don't really need a lot of interactive aspects to it for that purpose solely. But I think part of the conversation is like what actually is facilitating the driver of this. Stephen was talking about human agency. What are the issues beyond a kind of idea of performance that we always sort of deal with an explicit problem, and we don't necessarily, I mean, you talked about the inhabitants and how they would want to potentially microcontrol their environments. You may have different kinds of clients occupying the building, and they may have different sort of criteria. So I think there are values and there are ways to actually explore that once you've sort of developed it. And I think maybe that's part of the conversation. Yeah. Just because we exercise a certain function of design doesn't necessarily mean that those systems are relegated with only that kind of use or purpose. And that's where the opportunity comes, and I think that's where the acknowledgement has to happen, that there are a lot of issues on the table that we engage with within the paradoxes of developing architecture, where clients and engineers and sometimes even computer scientists really can't engage with that, and that's the notion of spatiality, the notion of experience, the curiosity if people are enabled to participate and engage with a system. Is it really completely bottom-up, or is it top-down programming? Those have to sort of evolve in a much more intelligent way if this is going to, let's say, go beyond the comments. Like, the Google car for me is as much a boring reality as an interactive facade in a certain sense, because part of that is to say, well, actually, it's not about just having cars that drive themselves and we sit there passively. It's a rethinking of what infrastructure and mobility could possibly be, where ownership resides in an individual car, as there are crowd sharing and sourcing and different ways of actually thinking about how we get from A to B. So I think there are a lot of things on the table that become super interesting. And the action of actually making that stuff is absolutely imperative.
Thank you. Questions and comments from the floor?
Of course, we're running late in time, so we may just have time for 2 really quick questions.
Right.
Yeah.
I was very impressed by the questions on the panel between the issue of sort of distributed sensing and centralized sort of Soviet-style sensing. For me, the biggest takeaway is the idea that you have to retreat into paper in order to describe in a persistent fashion the bid document in a way that's not proprietary. You have to move out of the Grasshopper, you have to move out of DP, and move into paper such that it's persistent over a period of time, such that when somebody wants to come back in and maybe modify behavior in 20 years, you've got it in persistent paper. I think that's just remarkable because of the way software comes and goes, and yet you now have something that has to behave over a period of years. Very interesting.
Precisely, thank you.
Just one comment on that one. I think the thing that we've seen with Patch Bay or COSM started by Usman is the open source movement, like, people coming and able to do and in participatory manner, tweaking with data. And I just wonder if there's a future in open source buildings, when buildings like this, and we again talk about opportunity, when we can actually just go in and again, making it as a second prototype, like prototype project collaboratively, and even looking at how about if these two towers can be cooperative, not just intelligent, but cooperative, and maybe sorting out things like, if there's certain weather environment that can create maybe even wind tunnel in the middle, and what would the building do? And so I think maybe if, just taking it from that comment there, if there's a way we can open source buildings and going into the systems and the actuations and the, sensing and the building monitoring systems, and maybe those things that have been connected with Patch Bay can be even spread out even further, so that not just the Internet of Things, but Internet of Buildings and the built environment itself.
Do you want me to respond to that? So I did actually write a text with Matthew Fuller called the Urban Versioning System 1.0, which was an attempt to kind of pull out the idea of what open source might be for architecture, both looking at it from a phenotype perspective as well as a kind of genotype. In other words, the open sourcing of the structure versus the open sourcing of the behavior. And of course, when you're confronted with the real world, there are all sorts of physical and societal constraints, as you point out. And I do want to say I'm not criticizing the building. I'm just trying to tease out the issues behind it, which I think, because I think that's kind of what one does at a conference, is trying to pull out.
You will be the 1 millionth. It's okay.
And I think that it actually, it kind of gives rise to these sort of really interesting questions about this kind of process of trying to open up to uncertainty, which is the kind of topic behind this conference, but at the same time being scared of uncertainty. And so, another example I'll give is, there are countless stories now about local governments that are basically rolling out parking systems where there are sensors put into parking spaces, and then you have an app and you can find out where to go and park. Now, the problem with that for me is that it completely excludes the capacity to say, why the hell are we driving and parking anyway? It excludes the capacity for citizens who are using it to say, well, what types of cars are actually parking? Well, let's re-script, let's reimagine what transportation might actually be, what mobility, as you were referring to in the city, might be. And so the extent to which these systems start getting imposed, generally in a kind of top-down way, is the extent to which it kind of excludes citizens, I think, from actively owning their city. Because the more that we have these structures and systems and infrastructures, and I've done a lot of stuff in the real world as well, and I totally understand. Dan Hill refers to dark matter as this stuff that you don't necessarily see, but which actually sort of is fundamental in determining some of the outcome. And so I suppose I'm trying to figure out, because I don't think necessarily just saying open source it is the answer here, because it has its application in the software world, and it has its positives and negatives. But just enabling people to feel like the city is not something that they're just occupying, but are actually constructing every day through their actions, through their decisions, through their sort of aspirations, through their kind of conversations and participation. That's the fundamental thing for me, to kind of have that engagement.
There's something that should be.
Well, I was going to agree with Usman. It seems to me the big risk here is perceptions of risk, and it's actually very telling that in a relatively patrimonial form of government, they would consider a distributed system to be a risky system. Yeah, it's quite easy to imagine that there are certain situations in which everything has to work together. That's good. What you do is you make things learn, and they would learn to collaborate. The irony is that in a big, risky, centralized system, there's only one computer to hack into to recode all of these to do really interesting things. And that would be fun.
I don't mind. I cannot say it to the client, but it would be interesting if somebody hacks into the system and tries something funny.
I think there's someone sitting out here that most likely will. I would just say this, that I don't think it's a choice anymore. I really do think when we talk about adaptation and we talk about all these features about systems and their ability to evolve over time, I think the best case scenario for that is that it's really this idea that technology will fail us. The robustness of a system is really in its ability to deal with things when things are really unexpected. We see that with natural disasters. We see that with a lot of population migration. There is no real concept of control as much as we really want to sort of believe that we play a part. And that's why I think participatory models are really important. I think social media is is an enabling agency, but actually the radicality of our built environment and infrastructure has to change, especially with all of this kind of push and desire towards urban inhabitation. It's not an issue about a building anymore either. And that's why I think the idea of the architect also has to evolve into different kinds of constructs and frameworks for space, because I think it's not an option anymore. I think if we treat it like that, then we talk about these things as novelty and add-ons, and wouldn't it be cool to put a facade, or wouldn't it be cool to make a responsive interior? But actually the project is much more a necessity than a novelty or a desire.
I think I have to thank everybody on the panel for a really interesting conversation. 2 mics, not one. And wind it up now, because I know we have an awful lot more to be going through today. I'd like to just say one last word, which is that I think that as we're reviewing what I've seen today, it's really quite nice, I think, to be in a quasi-architectural context here, so that we're allowed to think about, rather than an Internet of Things, an Internet of Spaces. So I'll wind it up on that. Thank you very much.